Get it? Bye. Okay, there we go.
We're using the device audio, then I gotta go. No, it's doing it. It's not mute, but I'm not hearing anything.
There you go.
Hello, hello, everybody.
Hi.
Bye-bye.
Hello, hello.
Is this on?
Thank
or
you.
what?
Oh, wow, now we're getting somewhere.
How's everybody doing?
Everyone's
Well,
doing
how are you?
okay.
Here?
Thank God. Okay.
Yes, I'm on now.
I see most everybody, which is good. A couple have the video turned off, but I see a lot of you, which is very nice.
Over here,
Well, right here.
so I can see it this time.
You can see.
I tried last time I couldn't see it.
Okay.
Do you hear me this week, Rabbi?
Yep, I hear
Okay.
you.
Great.
Leah, we can see you too.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Last week I was lurking. It was frustrating.
But now we've made it.
Yay. Thanks to my wonderful husband.
There we go.
The guy was in line in the back here.
Looked pretty good.
Yeah, so I see we have a few of us here, which is excellent. And we can begin a little bit, I think, because we got a lot to cover.
Great.
I'm just playing with this screen a little bit here, but I'm getting there. This is what it's still a learning on how to play with all this Zoom stuff. We're getting there. Okay, so for today's Bible study, the plan is to jump into a Passover-related text, Song of Songs. Song of Songs begins what I like to call the scroll cycle. There are 5 scrolls, 5 Megillot in the Jewish tradition. We just finished one with Purim, the one that's most well known, Megillat Esther. Esther is our our last scroll. As this Rick just popped in, I just want to see if he's okay. Rick, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay, cool. There we are. Okay, so Esther is our last scroll, that we read in the cycle. Passover starts the new cycle. So we have a Song of Songs, which is matched with Passover. Shavuot gets the Book of Ruth. Tisha B'Av gets Lamentations. Sukkot, Ecclesiastes. And so that's our sort of cycle of our different scrolls. Song of Songs is fascinating. Has anyone ever actually sat down to read Song of Songs?
I did.
Yeah. It's a really interesting book. It's a collection of what can best be described as love songs and or erotic poetry. And then one can wonder what this was doing in the Bible, which is part of our discussion today. The reason why love songs isn't exactly, I think, the best translation for it is that they don't use the word love almost at all in the text. It's about longing, it's about desire, it's about attraction and intimacy, more than it seems to be about actual romantic love. So it's very interesting, I think, just that we have a book like this. There's an idea that it might actually have been used before it became part of the canon, before it became part of the Bible, as entertainment. Like you would get up in your local tavern. You would maybe be in someone else's living room, and you would get up and you'd recite these poems for fun and for just enjoyment. And we know this is the case because there's a Talmudic text from Rabbi Akiva that is unhappy with the fact that this is actually happening. So it says, the rabbis taught, he who recites a verse of Song of Songs and treats it in a secular air, and one who recites a verse at the banqueting table in an unseemly fashion, of course, brings evil into the world. Okay, so doesn't sound off the top of our heads like the most theologically important material, but nonetheless, here it is. There's a thought that it could have also been used to be read at ancient wedding services. And in fact, today, Song of Songs is often quoted in wedding services. So, for example, if you've heard the expression, Ani lidodi v'dodi li, I am my beloved and my beloved is mine, that's an often recited verse at a wedding. That's from Song of Songs. And there's a few others that sort of fit that bill. It's the most famous. Now, why would it be recited during Passover? Springtime holiday, a lot about renewal and rebirth, lots of metaphors in Song of Songs, as we'll see, about the beauty of the earth. But what is it about Passover that speaks to the same theme of Song of Songs? The idea is that it's during Passover and Shavuot that our relationship with God becomes formalized. It's like we are getting married to God during this time period of our calendar. That Passover is like the engagement, and Shavuot is the wedding, where we get the 10 Commandments. That's our ketubah, right? And so that's the idea here, that is a reading of Song of Songs that basically says it's not about one person's love for another. It's about God's love for us and our love for God. And so we'll see some of those verses that sort of stretches credibility. But that being said, that's the theory behind it. That's not about a love songs between people. It's about our love for God and God's love for us. We have in our prayer book on Friday nights the Chadodi, right, which pictures the Sabbath as a bride, right, or a Sabbath queen. Some communities read Song of Songs during Shabbat for the same reason, that it's about the love between God and Israel. Another sort of more cheeky explanation for this is that Song of Songs is supposed to help encourage married couples to perform their Shabbat duty over the weekend. So, we have that as well. Yeah? Question?
No.
No? Okay. So as we mentioned, the reason why this is in our text is that we can't read it as a romantic text between people, according to the rabbis, but it's about God. It's about God and Israel and their relationship, God giving them the Torah, getting them out of Egypt, and the idea of that romantic relationship. If you remember from some of the books of the prophets that we read, Israel was often compared to an adulterous wife, right? The idea that Israel is cheating on God with idols. And so that it's a continuation of that metaphor that the Israelites are in some sort of formalized relationship with God that's supposed to be like a marriage. And so I think that's pretty fascinating. But there's no comment in Song of Songs at all that says that it's meant to be taken allegorically. There's no hint from the author. It's like we mentioned during our study of Esther, that there are hints from the author that the author means for this to be satire, means for it to be burlesque, means for it to not be taken literally. Song of Songs gives you no indication that it's supposed to be anything other than what it says on the front of it, basically, that it's about romantic, intentions. There's nothing mentioned about theology, nothing mentioned about history. It's just love poetry. In terms of themes, we're going to see that it has a very positive view of sex and intimacy. There's no talk in Song of Songs about be fruitful and multiply. There's no talk about procreation here. They're just having a good time. They're enjoying each other, which I think is fairly progressive. And what we'll see is that it's also strikingly egalitarian, that they possess each other equally, and that so the woman and the man in this relationship are both given equal voice. Actually, the woman, the female voice in this is actually stronger in the story, which might lend some credence to the idea that this might have been written by, or partially written by, a woman. We're not sure. The author is unknown, as we'll get to in a minute or two. And so we'll see cycles between the joys of togetherness and the hurt of being away from each other. So you're going to take a look. I'm about to share a document that's going to come up, hopefully, if this all works according to Hoyle. Okay. You see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. I'm just trying to get the best view myself of everybody. That's as good as it's going to get, I think. Okay. There we go. Now we're talking. Okay. So you'll see here, this is our first text of Song of Songs. Marilyn, you want to give this a read?
Upon my couch at night, I sought the one I loved. I sought, but found him not. I must rise and roam the town, through the streets and through the squares. I must seek the one I love. I sought, but found him not. I met the watchmen who patrol the town. Have you seen the one I love? Scarcely had I passed them when I found the one I love. I held him fast. I would not let him go till I brought him to my mother's house, to the chamber of her who conceived me.
Okay, excellent. So all about God and Israel, right?
Yeah, right.
That doesn't strike you as overly divine?
I don't think so.
You don't think so, but but it's interesting, right? That how could we view it as God? Just from this one.
Because you never know when you're going to find the one you love.
And is God sometimes easy to find or hard to find?
Hard.
Yeah, so that could be part of the idea here in terms of their interpretation, right? That, either God is searching for us or we are searching for God, right? And that it's not always easy in that relationship. You have to sort of work for it. So, of course, on just the clear, a simple pashat, as we say in Hebrew, the interpretation of it, it doesn't really feel like we're talking about God here, I think is the greater point, right?
Right. But you know what, Rabbi? I think what makes it hard to find God, or one of the things, is that we don't know what he looks like, he or she. We have no clue if this is an alien being or if it's a person-like looking thing or what,
Yeah.
So I think it makes it hard.
Well,
And I think,
Well, but can it be, I'm wondering, but can it be also like a feeling, in terms of, when you find the one you love, it's not necessarily what he or she may appear physically, but what we feel, something more from that perspective as opposed to what we see.
Yeah, I think a lot of feeling comes in here, a lot of emotion, right? And I think the idea of longing for God and or God's longing for us. Abraham Joshua Heschel literally wrote the book on that, sort of idea, that theory of, the idea of us, the humankind and God searching for each other. It's a big part of his, his theological work. Is that, and similar to Martin Buber as well in terms of the relationship aspect. But yeah, it's I think when you look at it from an attempted allegorical perspective, that's sort of what I get out of it, is that, God and the Israelites are looking for each other. And even if we want to look at it historically, when the people are in exile, right, they might be searching, for God, or searching for a spiritual home, searching for connection, right, searching for a sense of belonging, as well. So I think there's a lot there that one can look at from a theological perspective. So we're going to just go back for a second. And so we talked about that a little bit. What's really interesting about this book is that there's a lot of references to the topography of Israel. It's very geographical in nature. And so you get a lot of, little notes about the hills and valleys and the mountains, a lot of place names that we don't get in a lot of places in the Bible. Also about the 7 species, the fruits, the grains, a lot of other the foods, the pomegranates are mentioned repeatedly in Song of Songs. And so it shouldn't surprise us that this work was actually used a lot in the early Zionist movement when they're talking about creating the state of Israel. And a lot is mentioned about springtime, and sort of that imagery as well. I'm actually going to pop up another text here for us to take a look at. Let me see here. Getting more confident with this. Okay, so you should see a text now. Yes.
Wow. Yeah.
Okay. Song of Songs, 2:8. Right. We'll see that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. Good deal. Okay. So, Leah, you want to give that a read?
I would like to, but it's pretty tiny.
Pretty tiny.
Is there any way to spread that?
Oh, I think it's good.
Let's see.
Okay.
Use your fingers.
Yeah.
Well, I tried that last week and there was a line then on his text and he didn't like that.
Yeah. Let's see.
Right.
That a little better?
No, I think I better, let me try. Hark, my beloved. There he comes. I better give this to somebody else. It's
Okay.
too small.
No problem. Sandy, can you catch that?
Sure. I can. Hark, my beloved. There he comes, leaping over mountains, bounding over hills. My beloved is like a gazelle or like a young stag. There he stands behind our wall, gazing through the window, peering through the lattice. My beloved spoke thus to me, arise, my darling, my fair one, come away. For now the winter is past. The winter is past, the rains are over and gone. The blossoms have appeared in the land. The time of pruning has come. The song of the turtle dove is heard in our land. The green figs form on the fig tree. The vines in blossom give off fragrance. Arise, my darling, my fair one, come away.
Oh, isn't that nice?
Yeah.
My good glasses are in
Do you
the
feel God's presence in that text?
I can't read.
Thank you.
Right. So again, the literal meaning here, I think, is pretty apparent. But we talk about again this imagery about the land and about the fruit and the vegetables, of Israel, and also even some animals. Okay, we get a lot about deers and gazelles and stags, in this text. Sheep and whatnot also come into play. So. But then we get, come away, the winter's past, the rains are gone. Now it's springtime, right? That's this connection to Passover, which is a springtime holiday. The blossoms, the turtle doves, it's very picturesque, right? It's a very picturesque text. There's a lot of imagery and a lot of metaphor, used here. So I think that's a pretty interesting passage. But again, this idea about come away with me, it's time. This imagery of like the two young lovers running throughout the fields of Jerusalem together, or of Israel together, sort of finding their little love nests come in to play often as part of the theme of the text. It's a lot of searching and finding, and then the joy of finding one's beloved.
There's one in the bathroom.
Okay. We're going to get back a little bit before we get to our main event here. So the authorship of the text, as I mentioned, is unknown. Does anyone know what it's traditionally attributed to?
David?
Solomon?
It's a good guess. Solomon. Yeah, it's actually one of the 3 books that Solomon is supposed to have written. Solomon is supposed to have written Song of Songs in his youth, Proverbs in his middle age, and Ecclesiastes in his old age. And so Song of Songs is when he's full of youthful vigor and he's a romantic, and there's love everywhere. According to tradition, do you know how many wives Solomon had?
1,000.
He had 700 wives and 300 concubines.
Yes.
So
No
number
wonder
of
he died.
1,000.
No wonder he died early.
Yeah.
Died happy.
So the rabbis use that as a way of thinking that maybe he would probably know a little something about love and love poetry if he had to sort of be with 1,000 women.
God.
I picture the deli counter at Publix. So you sort of take a number. I picture it outside of his bedroom.
Oh my God.
Sort of taking a number. Wife
You
number.
can only see your wife once every 3 years.
Yeah, it's exactly right. So it's a little complicated to say the least. The text does use the word for king several times, so that does help us a little bit with that idea. But when you really study the text and really read it, it's hard to imagine Solomon would have wrote it because the Hebrew is different than during his time of life. It doesn't match well to the Hebrew of Solomon's time. So I'm going to give you an example that there's a Hebrew word. Well, technically speaking, that's the point. It's a loan word from the Persian. The word is pardes, and pardes means orchid. It means in paradise, and this is more obviously English. From pardes, we get the paradise. But an orchard, where there are flowers and whatever it is. That's a 4th century word. Solomon was long dead before the 4th century. CE. Solomon died 10th century. So it's hard to imagine, because that word wouldn't have been there. There's also some allusions to Greek practices in the text, and that's much later
That's way too
as
long.
well. So it doesn't really look like Solomon wrote it, but again, one can see the idea, and we see this often in biblical texts where it's easier and makes the book more popular if you attribute it to somebody famous. Instead of Joe Schmo writing a book of poetry, it's King Solomon writing a book of poetry. And that's a better seller, right? That flies off the shelves much easier than Honey Poloni's book of love songs. If it's King Solomon's book of love songs, it has more gravitas to it.
If I may,
Mhm.
if I may ask, what is the time frame for the Song of Songs? For when was that whole group of things written?
Yeah, so they're thinking around 4th century, 3rd century BCE.
Okay.
They're saying a little bit closer to the 3rd century because of the Greek influence. 4th century would have gotten you to the Greeks too, but a little later dating was probably closer to it. So that's sort of, we would say, 4th century, 3rd century, in that area for composition, and like other books as well, redaction. There's clearly the hand of an editor here. I don't think that these were necessarily just an anthology, of 8 that was by one author. I think it was an anthology that was put together. But that's unclear too. There are some who read this as this one long poem, whereas others chop it up into different sections. So I think that's, again, pretty different, that we have this idea of a text that could have not only many authors, but again, possibly a female author as well, possibly some influence there. Possibly. I'd like to think, but we'll see. We're going to study chapter 1 now of A Song of Songs. What we're going to do is that we're going to read the whole thing first. Then we're going to go back and break it up verse by verse, talk about the different levels of interpretation of the text. So we're going to look at maybe what the plain sense of it, might mean. But then I'm also going to give you some commentary, and I'm going to use 3 different sources. I'm going to use what's called Targum, which is a Aramaic translation of the text, which also provides a lot of commentary to the text. I'm going to use that. That's 4th century CE to 8th century CE. We're not sure what the exact dating, because again, it's probably written over time. So we're going to use that. Anyone heard of Rashi?
Yes.
Okay, so Rashi we're going to use too. Shlomo ben Yitzchak, he is a medieval French commentator. He has basically written commentaries on everything and anything Jewish that was done up to that time. Very influential. And Abraham ibn Ezra, who was a Spanish commentator a little bit after Rashi. There was a little overlap in their lifetimes, but he was after Rashi. He was a Torah commentator, a poet, a philosopher, and a grammarian. So he was pretty busy. He was a Renaissance man of sorts. And so we're going to use those, and of course, again, the text itself and our own opinions, our own ideas. Okay, so now we're going to get back to it. Okay, boom. Okay. Everyone sees chapter 1?
Yes, I could read that.
There we go. That one came up a little bigger for you?
Yes.
I don't know why. It's interesting. Okay. So now that you can see it, do you want to give that a little bit of a read, Leah?
Sure. Chapter 1, the Song of Songs by Solomon. Kiss me with the kisses of your mouth, for your caresses are better than wine. Your perfume is delightful to smell. Your name is like fragrant oil. That is why young girls love you. Pull me after you. Let's run. The king has brought me into his room. Let's rejoice and be glad with you. Let's remind ourselves that your caresses are better than wine. Rightly, they have loved you.
Very nice. Debbie, you want to pick up from there?
I am dark but beautiful, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. Don't look down at me because I have become dark. It is the sun that has scorched me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me guard the vineyards, but my own vineyard I could not guard.
Okay. Bernie, you there?
Yes,
You want to give that a read?
tell me, my soul's dear love, where are you grazing your sheep? Where are you resting them at noon? Why should I be as one who is lost near the flock of your friends? O most beautiful of women, if you do not know, follow the tracks of the flock and graze your kids near the tents of the shepherds.
Thank you. Rick, you there?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, my darling, you are like a mare in Pharaoh's chariots. Ornamented rows make your cheeks look pretty, as does a necklace on your throat. We will make for you ornamented rows of gold with inlaid points of silver. While the ruler is at the banquet table, my nard provides a fragrance. My beloved is my bag of myrrh resting between my breasts. My beloved is my cluster of henna blooms from the vineyards of En-Gedi.
Very nice. Robin, you want to pick up the last part?
Sure. Oh, you are beautiful, my darling. You are beautiful. Your eyes are like those of doves. Oh, my beloved, you are handsome and beautiful, and our bed is shaded by leaves. The beams of our house are cedars. Our rafters are juniper.
Oh, isn't that nice, everybody?
Mhm.
Can you feel the divine presence?
Not
Very
really.
idyllic.
No,
Yeah, I know. When you read it, it's like, it feels like it is what it is, so to speak, but
Yeah.
to me, it's really interesting how the rabbi sort of took this and said, yeah, it's love poetry, it's great, but it's about God. I feel like it has to take a little bit of a stretch. My guess would be is that this was already entered into the canon, and then they have to justify it afterwards. And I think the Solomon attribution helps. That King Solomon writes it, you sort of have to add it in. But when you read it, just trying to read it, it's tough to sort of see the theology behind it. That being said, we'll give it a shot. So let's start with verse 2. Roll 1 and 2 we can look at together. So the Song of Songs by Solomon. So right there it tells you, by Solomon. Easy, no fuss, no muss. That gives you the Solomon headline there. Kiss me with the kisses of your mouth. Your caresses are better than wine. What does that mean?
It's a good
You get drunk on them.
Bingo. That's good. Good start. Drunk on love, right?
I love
So that's a really cool feeling for those who've experienced it. The idea that, you can love somebody so much, you're actually intoxicated by them. And again, a little less with the romance, a little more to physical. It's really physical intimacy here that is intoxicating. Just being with each other, in that caress, that embrace is intoxicating. So I think that's, very interesting. So fine. So where do the rabbis take this? Who's the kisses of your mouth refer to? Torah, of course, because that's what you think of when you read this verse.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
I didn't get that.
Yes, I see it now.
You see it now. You see all about Torah when you read that. Get your minds out of the gutter. It's all about Torah. Looking at this thing askance. How dare you? So the Targum has this as praise of God for giving the Torah, the Mishnah, and the Talmud in the same face-to-face manner as one would kiss a partner, right? And so his mouth is the reference to oral Torah, that is.
Yeah.
And so that is the kisses of his mouth, is oral Torah, oral law. Rashi says that the congregation of Israel is the young woman who is speaking, but in exile, and she is longing for the affection of her groom, meaning God, that she had when she was a bride, right? So she's remembering, Israel's remembering fondly the time of passionate connection and embrace with God that is now no longer there. Ibn Ezra is a little bit more realistic, sort of says, yes, it's a woman who longs for many kisses. Easy enough, right? But what's fascinating about this, when you think about it that way, and he's going to go to the metaphor in a second, but I mentioned before about how there's an egalitarian feel to this book. So the idea here that a woman enjoys and longs for physical intimacy, that's a more of a modern conception, right? A more of a modern perception than it was back then. And so the fact that it's here now as something acceptable for the woman to be longing for that physical intimacy, I think, again, it was a little bit ahead of its time. Ibn Ezra, of course, does eventually say too, but it also means Torah, and it also means mitzvot. The kisses are Torah, and the caresses are mitzvot, that are better than wine. Okay, so that's how we get around that. So let's look at 3. The perfume is delightful to the smell. Your name is like fragrant oil. What do we think? Can we find the divine there? That's why the young girls love you. Yeah, so it's interesting what they have here. The idea that it's about miracles and about Israel experiencing God's miracles in Egypt. That this is a reference to the many signs and wonders that the Israelites experienced during the Exodus from Egypt. And Rashi sticks more to the plain sense, but the importance of having a good name, right? What does it mean to have a good name? And that's usually in Jewish tradition about doing mitzvot, right? And doing good deeds and being well thought of for one's study and piety, right? And so that's why your name is like fragrant oil. But where he takes it a different step is that he also links it to people who convert to Judaism, Jews by choice, that they are, these people who are delightful, so to speak, to smell, and whose names are like fragrant oil because they've chosen this path. And that is why, they're beloved in this context. Pull me after you, let's run. The king has brought me into his room. Let's rejoice and be glad with you. Let's remind ourselves that your caresses are better than wine. Rightly, they have loved you. What makes this verse tricky is that you can see there's a tense shift, right? So pull me after you, let's run. Then it sort of goes a little bit third person here and there, and it becomes a little bit awkward. The translation tries to fix that a little bit, but it's still a little awkward in terms of the phrasing. There's an idea that there's an amendation here that it says, instead of the king has brought me into his room, that it should read, O king, you have brought me into your room. And that would make it flow a little bit better than the sort of awkward phrasing that we have here. That being said, if it's the king has brought me into his room, what are they talking about here? Is there a possible love triangle? Are they engaging in a little role play? We don't know what's happening here, but there's different layers of interpretation for what this actually could mean, because we don't get the sense that her lover that she's speaking about throughout the passage is actually a king, is actually a King Solomon. But where they are going, so to speak, to engage in some earthly delights is sort of like their own royal bedchamber, which is, again, a very sweet thought, that when we're with our beloved, anywhere is sort of a palace, anywhere can sort of be seen as a beautiful place. The Targum, of course, has this as, the pull me after you, let's run, is that this is God's presence leading the Israelites through the wilderness with the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke, right? So that on the way to receive Torah. So they're going to go together. They're going to journey from Egypt to Mount Sinai, right? They're going to run together for those 40 days from Egypt to Sinai. So that's really what it means. Nothing physical to see here. It's all about Torah. And Israel as a new bride committing themselves to God. We're going to get to a challenging passage for many reasons coming up next. I am dark and beautiful. Oh, sorry, that's the whole point. I am dark but beautiful, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, the curtains of Solomon. Don't look down at me because I am dark. That's the sun that have scorched me, etc., etc. So there's a sort of an issue here with dark skin and whether dark skin is an issue or not. And certainly, as progressive as I mentioned, in terms of egalitarianism we had, there is certainly maybe some racial bias, some racial issues in this text, that dark skin could be seen as a detriment to physical beauty. 2,500 years ago, it happens. The Targum actually makes this worse and not better for us, the interpretation, that there's a midrash that talks about the punishment that the Israelites suffered after the sin of the golden calf, where the faces of the Israelites were all turned black as a punishment. And so I think that's what the Targum is seeing with I am dark but beautiful, right? That this is after they get punished for the sin of the golden calf. Rashi looks at the idea of darkness metaphorically, gets off the skin issue, that darkness is a metaphor for captivity of the people of Israel after the exile out of Israel. So that's what they're looking at here. Ibn Ezra, of course, wants to stretch it for us, where it says that dark actually does mean beautiful. It actually is supposed to be synonymous, where it's dark and beautiful, not dark but beautiful. But it's supposed to be an attempt to avoid the evil eye. We're all familiar with that idea of avoiding the evil eye.
Mm-hmm.
You don't praise yourself too much, or you're going to get the divine zets, the divine smack. So Ibn Ezra sort of reads this as the idea of saying that it's almost like being self-critical in order to not get, bad luck put on us. Of course, it's a pretty hard reading to justify, to be honest, but especially considering the next verse, which is, don't look down upon me because I am dark. So the darkness is not seen as a positive in any way. That the speaker seems to be embarrassed by the darkness of their skin color because they work in the fields too much and gotten sort of suntanned and sunburnt. The Targum continues with that idea on verse 6 that this happens again to the Israelites where they follow the advice of false prophets. So they go out of their own vineyard, right? So you have the idea of their own vineyards they don't guard because they left their vineyards of their gods, so to speak, and went to the vineyards of other gods. And because they did that, they got punished by, once again, darkening of the skin. Okay, and so that's where the Targum sort of takes it, the idea that this darkening of the skin is punishment for sin. And especially here regarding worship of the sun or worshiping of the moon. Rashi chimes in with mother's son over here. The idea my mother's sons were angry with me was reference to the Egyptians. That the Egyptians are angry because they're leaving, sort of Egypt, and they got hit with the plagues. The vines, again, go back to idolatry. The idea that they go to vineyards that are not their own. If we look at verse 7, grazing of the sheep, right? Where are you grazing your sheep? Where are you resting them at noon? Why should I be as one who is lost near the flocks of your friends? What do we take that to mean in terms of just a regular reading of it?
Is she lost?
He's lost, and she can't
From God.
find him. Yeah, she's lost, right? And she doesn't know where her boyfriend is. She don't know where he is. And wants to find him at what time?
Noon.
Noon. Why noon?
It's light outside. It's
Light outside.
You can
If
see
you're a
everything.
shepherd, you're working hard during the day, right? And so what do you do at noon usually?
Take
Take a
break.
nap.
Take a little break, a little work break. So I think she's looking for him because with a shepherd, right, they're always moving, right, because they have to graze the sheep. So they're moving in different areas. That's a common trade, obviously, back in this time period. So the shepherd is moving all around with the sheep, and she's looking for him. Where are you? Where are you resting them at noon? Because I might want to, let's say, meet up for lunch. Okay? And was that delicate enough for us?
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Yeah, she has to know where he is because they're gonna meet up for lunch.
Booty call.
And so she's got to find him, But so she's lost trying to find him for a noon get together. And so, of course, this can't be the reading of it from a rabbinic standpoint. In a nice leap here of rabbinic thought, the idea here is that it's actually Moses talking to God, asking God to allow him to glimpse into Israel's future, see how they're going to endure exile and future conflicts. So why should I be so far, right, from the Israelites? Why should I not know what's going to happen to our sheep, so to speak? If you picture God and Moses as co-parents, right, of the Israelite people, what's going to happen? I don't know what's going to happen. I want to know that when I'm dead, I'm not Nebo, right? I want what's going to happen to the Israelites in the future. Ibn Ezra takes it a different direction and says it's all about repentance. We're seeking God's forgiveness during this passage here, which is, again, not my reading of it in terms of a plain sense reading. But the idea is that when we're looking for repentance, we're sort of lost, right? And we want to find God and we want to seek God so we can make amends what we have done wrong, right? So we have the idea of the Israelites seeking and searching for God to be able to ask for forgiveness for our sins, and in that way create a stronger relationship, right? Because God views repentance as a very laudable and very important quality, and that it's said that nobody is closer to God than the ones who are repentant, the ones who seek atonement and forgiveness. Those are the ones closest to God. And as part of a relationship, the divine relationship, I'm saying now with the Israelites, repentance is an important part of it, that the ability for us to say to God and for God to say to us, that we can make mistakes, but we're still in the relationship together, and in fact, again, the mistakes, once we're forgiven from them, can get us actually closer together than before. So a deep yearning for repentance is what this is about. And then there's the response, right? O most beautiful of women, if you do not know, follow the tracks of the flock and graze your kids near the tents of the shepherds. Has anyone read Greek tragedies before? So the Oedipus,
Yes.
Right.
works of
Required
Sophocles,
reading.
Euripides, all this other stuff. So you have this rhetorical device, or literary device, I should say, that they use, the Greek chorus, where the Greek chorus sort of comes out to fill in all the blanks. This line was probably meant to be almost like a Greek chorus kind of line, where it's taken a sort of a step back, and they would say, "Oh, this is where you should go," because it's not really written in the voice of the person who is speaking verse 7. It seems to be a voice that was meant to be, again, sort of a narrative voice that comes through, or again, it could just be some dude that's there to tell her what direction to go. An allusion to the Jacob story as well, or the better said, the Joseph story as well, where Joseph needs to find his brothers and doesn't know where to go and has to sort of find where they're grazing their sheep. And he gets pointed in the right direction by a stranger, not named in the text. Again, so he's go this way. They aren't there; they're over here. And the reason why that story is so fascinating, or that little plot point, is because if it wasn't for Joseph finding the stranger to tell him where his brothers are, we might never have gotten to Egypt in the first place. Because when he finds his brothers, he gets thrown into the pit and then sold into slavery. So everything that follows hinges on that one moment of saying, where are my brothers? They're over there. And so he has to go find them and go in the right direction. And so she similarly is looking for her companion, looking for her beloved, and has no idea where to go. And someone's telling her, go this way. And so if you look at it back from the Targum explanation, the idea is here is that it's actually God's response to Moses. Moses saying, let me know what's going to happen, in the future to the Israelites. Let me know what's in their future, how they're going to resolve all these different challenges and conflicts. God saying, you know what, you're going to see them from afar, sort of follow the tracks, and then you sort of you can look at it, but not close by. It's not going to, you're not going to be able to shepherd them sort of into the land anymore.
Mhm.
It's going to be a different kind of relationship. Okay, I'm going to keep on moving forward because I see that we're getting a little closer. 8 o'clock. Speaking of Egypt. Oh, my darling, you are like a mare in Pharaoh's chariots. What a pickup line that is. We don't usually, and that's part of the fun of reading this book, is that some of these lines we don't necessarily equate with beauty. I'm not really sure if our significant other compared us to a mare in Pharaoh's chariots. That would particularly be helpful to us and our romantic mood.
No, you should check out some of those mares.
Yeah, exactly. Look, to each their own. I don't judge. But we can definitely presume this is meant to be a very complimentary line, and that's supposed to have a lot of sort of good qualities to it. The ornamented rose is it's a lot about jewelry here as well. So if you look at 9 still, you're like a mare in Pharaoh's chariots. The rabbis are going to take this to be an allusion to the Red Sea and the miracle of the Red Sea. But there's actually a commentary that says God provides the Israelites with mares, with horses, to help cross the sea, to help escape the Egyptians, to sort of be a counterpoint to the Egyptian horses and chariots that are coming through. And so then when we get to verse 10, again,
Is it not?
Hmm?
Is it not an insult though to be compared to Pharaoh's chariot?
Yeah, so that they're not seeing it, I guess the Egyptian horses were probably seen as the most beautiful in the world. Just like, now, depending on where the horse is bred from, there's a certain level of, importance and whatever. I still almost think about it like dogs too, which again, maybe not a good comparison either romantically, but the idea being that if you have a purebred dog or whatever it might be, that, oh, you're so beauty as, or whatever, a purebred stallion or a purebred mare. And the Egyptians were probably known for the highest quality and most desirable, maybe as well, maybe the most expensive, the most precious. A lot of troubling language we're getting into. So if at 10, the idea that, look, simple statement, right? Jewelry is nice. And, you get that with 10 and 11, that jewelry can enhance physical beauty. But of course, the Targum's not going to help us here very much, and say that the row and the necklace refers to a bridle and a bit for a horse, continuing the equine metaphor. The idea that it's going to help guide, right? That's what the bridle and the bit does, right? It helps guide the horse. So in the same way, the words of Torah, help direct the Jewish people, and that enhances not our physical beauty, but our spiritual beauty.
Spiritual.
Yes, it's all spiritual, right? If you get to 11, ornamented rows of gold inlaid with points of silver, that is supposed to be a reference to the 10 Commandments, actually. That the 10 Commandments are hewn from sapphire of God's throne of glory. And the inlaid points is again more of an obscure reference, but we have this idea that it could also mean that Pharaoh's chariots, right, there's a question, taking a step back, of how the Israelites get so rich when they're in the wilderness, and the idea is that they plunder the Egyptians. So according to a tradition, that when Pharaoh's chariots come to race against the Israelites, the Red Sea, that they actually brought the treasury with them. They brought all this gold and silver and with them at this time. So when everything gets blown up, the Israelites take all the gold and silver from the Egyptians actually at the Red Sea. They're able to carry it off at this point. I want to get to the next one here. While the ruler is at the banquet table, my nard provides a fragrance.
What's an art?
And what's
Indeed, a great question you ask. And so a nard is an aromatic drug that's it's usually used for perfume, made from a plant that grows in the Himalayas. And so it smells so good, it pleases her lover, you know. And so the physical part of this is that smell, you know, can be an intoxicant as well. You know, that's why we have perfumes and colognes and pheromones or whatever else it might be. That smell can be an important part of physical attraction. And so while the ruler is doing his thing, she is giving off a pleasing scent, okay, a pleasing perfume from the Himalayan nard. They take this the opposite way because, you know, the Targum wants to give us a different explanation, that it compares it to the building of the golden calf, that the ruler, i.e. Moses, is at the banquet table. He's up on the mountain getting the 10 Commandments. And what are the people doing at this time? Building the calf, right?
The calf,
And the calf, the sin is so bad, it actually physically stinks. It's the stench of vice. And so that's the nard providing the fragrance. So taking this beautiful idea of the beautiful smelling perfume and turning it into something a little bit more gross. That the sin is so bad, the sin actually fouls up the air. That evil has taken place of the good. Ibn Ezra goes back to the happy side of things and says this is a foreshadowing of the advent of the Messiah. The idea that eventually, you know, the Messiah is going to come and we're going to have all these good smells of the incense in the next temple, right? A very divinely inspired verse on 13. My beloved is a bag of myrrh resting between my breasts. If you could find God in that one, here's to you. We went back on 12 with the idea of, again, smell being important in sensuality and intimacy. The Targum, of course, continues the golden calf metaphor here. Ibn Ezra gets the win here, I think, for the most bizarre reading of this. Between my breasts refers to the two cherubim, the two angels that stood above the ark cover of the sanctuary. Sure it does, Ibn Ezra. Sure it does. Gotta take a long walk to get there.
yeah.
None of the commentators, surprisingly, really comment on the explicitly erotic nature of the verse. They all want to find different explanations for it. But one could sort of give a challenge to the rabbis on this, is that if they looked at this image differently, they could have even maybe gone to a more maternal image, right? You know, give the nurturing presence of God if they really want to do something different, but they don't get there as well. It's more of a modern interpretation. And so that's, you know, we have a little bit more. These last parts over here about henna. We're familiar with henna.
Yes.
Mhm.
The reason is for the past 15 years, everyone's doing it. But, you know, 50 years ago, you know, or more, probably less so, no one was doing it unless you were from the Near East. That was really it. You know, it was more of a Eastern tradition. Now it's become sort of hip and pop culture-y. And so now every other wedding has henna tattoos. And so in Hebrew, henna is hakofer, which is actually similar to the word for atonement. So they use this as an atonement metaphor about the idea of atonement and repentance being you know, very important and very, you know, that we have to seek it out. Ein Gedi, they used to make, and they still do, you know, now it's more of a spa, but they used to make wine there. And so that's why you have the vineyards of Ein Gedi being a very popular destination. Has anyone been to Ein Gedi?
Yes, I camped for a month in the fruit orchards there one time,
Oh, beautiful. Yeah.
and went hiking back in the hills.
Oh, it's a lovely place, right?
Oh, gorgeous.
That's gorgeous. Yeah. And so back then, gorgeous too. You are beautiful, my darling, beautiful. Your eyes are like those of doves. When you think of an animal with really cool eyes, do doves come into play?
No.
Not really. So it's sort of confusing. We don't really know why doves here are the go-to for a comparison of why doves and eyes go together. Other than just the doves can be seen as beautiful and eyes can be seen as beautiful, but I don't think of doves themselves have particularly beautiful eyes. But doves are very, symbolic as well of peace, I think actually peace I could come up with for that. But the idea that they have clear eyes that indicate physical health. So Israel has religious leaders who will lead them to spiritual health. We are like your doves, helping you go to higher spiritual ground. And all the stuff about the temple, you're handsome and our bed is shaded by leaves. The beams of our house are cedars. Our rafters are juniper. Are usually seen as allusions to the temple, which is built of wood and built, with a sense of spiritual beauty. So they're going to take the physical and spiritual beauty and meld them together to get to more of a temple metaphor as well. Though, of course, again, the plain reading is a little bit different. Again, about them finding their lover's hideaway and sort of being together in a very idyllic place. That one can argue, in Jerusalem, how many places actually do look like this. So it might be, again, a fantasy in their mind's eye. But again, I think it comes to that idea that when you're with the person you're meant to be with, and you're in that, state of intimacy, that anywhere you are can be seen as beautiful. And it's a time for great poetry and great delight. Any questions?
No.
No.
Interesting.
No.
Okay, well that's going to do it for our Bible study portion. Next week it's going to be right before Seder, right? If memory serves. Like we're getting down to it, and so we might do something about the Seder. We're going to do a virtual Zoom Seder the second night, but I think I'm going to talk about next week what the origin and development of the Passover Seder. And so that'll be sort of next week's thing. Okay.
Yep. Okay.
Next is Derek
Thank
Shura and Milton Steinberg. If you want to stay on for that, everyone's welcome to learn a little bit of theology. You can take a 2-minute break to stretch, and then we're going to pop on in a minute, okay?
Okay.
All right. Have a good evening.
Do we need to sign out and sign back in?
No, I'm saying if you're on, you're on.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, the room for that.
Okay.
You read my book.
Yeah, I gotta figure out how to sign off. Waiting.
Can you still hear me?
Yep.
Rabbi, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
I read something today that compared the last verse 15, sentence 15, with the shores of Israel, the ocean.
Ocean, yeah.
Looking at the coastline off of Israel. This is so far-fetched for me to.
See, well, that's got me close enough.
Where's your face?
Right there.
Kind of halfway down the screen. Robin,
Yeah.
it's Karen Roth. How are you?
Okay.
I haven't seen you in ages.
Well, I just moved. I'm now living in Dunedin.
Oh, well, good. Good.
So I'll be able to come to things.
I think about your mother all the time.
Robin, this is
Yeah.
Cindy. Whereabouts in Dunedin?
Right off of Belcher, just north of Solon.
Oh, I am right off of Solon. You must be almost my neighbor.
I guess.
Okay.
I'm on a little street called Park Lane.
My street is right off of Solon.
I can go back to my book.
To Dunedin.
I think this is.
Okay, so
It's better than it was. Yeah, I can go back to these. I'm afraid it's gonna fall.
It's in the phone that you pull on it. Pick it up and throw it.
Yeah, but I can go back to these. That's no problem.
Well, I mean, you see,
Okay, let's dive in.
it's like a
20th century. For those of us joining us for the first time, we've been taking a look at some different ways that Jewish philosophers, rabbis, thinkers have conceived God. Because theology, the study of the divine, Jewish theology has viewed God in many different ways. Some more classical, and some a little bit more complex, or maybe even a little antithetical to what we were taught about God as children, and maybe moving away from some of the biblical and early rabbinic views of what God is and isn't. And so we looked at Philo, we looked at the Jewish mystics, we looked at at Maimonides, we looked at Martin Buber, and so now we're going to get to somebody named Rabbi Milton Steinberg, most known for, I'm going to get to that in a minute or two, the book As a Driven Leaf, which is a work of historical fiction, a fascinating book in my opinion, if one likes that sort of thing. So I'll touch upon that in a little more detail. But he's going to espouse a theory which was popular during his time and is popular today about limited theism, about the idea of a limited conception of God. Kushner also speaks about this in some detail as well as part of his theology, the idea of a limited deity, a God who is not all powerful or maybe not all knowing. And so can we conceive of a God who doesn't fit those descriptions? Because in our basic concepts, it doesn't really match up in the same way. What I'm going to do now is going to put this up for you, since I know it's easier to read along sometimes. So I'm going to put this up. Everyone's got the Word document there?
Mhm.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are basic concepts of classical theism, of the belief in God. Gary, you want to give us a read over here? Can you see that? Not sure if you can hear me. Okay, Marilyn, you want to give that a shot?
Yep, you ready?
Yep.
Okay. God is one and alone. God, though not possessing a body, is a spiritual being that expresses will, love, and concern for the created world. God is all powerful, able to upset laws of nature at will. God can create miracles. God is all good. God is all knowing, past and future. God is supernatural and transnatural. God is inside of, as well as within the universe. God knows and hears my prayers and answers them, though we may not always realize how and when.
Okay, good. So that sound right in terms of a sort of a classical depiction of God?
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
So, Judaism affirms the idea, obviously, in the Bible, of a singular deity. God is one and alone. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. God's oneness is reaffirmed in the works of the prophets as well. But we get to more of an idea of radical monotheism as opposed to monolatrism. So we have this idea of God being the one and only. But there aren't many other deities also. There's just one God, and that's it. There's no other gods. Or with our God being better, right? They don't have that conception anymore. That it's just
Can you
one God.
define transnatural?
Oh yeah, we'll get there definitely. I'll look at transnatural. Two, God not possessing a body. God is wholly spiritual and not physical at all. which is again a tougher thing, as we heard in the last session a little bit. That idea that God not having a physical presence, it can be a disconnect. And that when we picture God, how many of us, as I like to say, were brought up with the idea, or at least the vision of God as the old white man with a beard, on a cloud,
Yep.
that is looking down, whatever, when things go badly. That's the imagery that we get, and is sometimes reinforced in our liturgy, depending on what holiday it is. I'm thinking more of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, where that sort of vision of God becomes more to the forefront. But the idea is that God expresses will. God can influence things. God has love and concern. So I go back to the idea of anthropomorphic, meaning, possessing of physical qualities, and anthropopathic, the idea of God having emotions, right? God having the ability to be sad, mad, happy, because in the Torah, God gets angry. God has emotions like a human being does. And
It's just like we were just reading, I was just going over Ezekiel, and he expressed that feeling in Ezekiel. That we just,
definitely, yeah. Throughout the prophets, we get this idea that God has, again, these very strong emotions, and the
can
prophets
get
usually
angry.
anger. Yeah, it's usually anger. It's funny because it's always expressed physically too. The idea of that in Hebrew, the metaphor, right? The imagery is God's nose getting hot. And when God's nose gets hot, that means God is getting angry. That's the expression, is that because when we get angry, our face gets all flushed, maybe, and we feel sort of that heat. So the idea of the nose getting hot is a metaphor, and it's an image for anger. God is all powerful. Miracles are seen as the ultimate act of power, because if there's a natural world that we enjoy, right, that a miracle is the superseding, right, of the natural world. And only God can do that. God can upset the laws of nature at God's will. So if you have the story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, where God makes the sun stand still, right? So that's, God can do that. God can subvert the laws of nature. God is all good by definition, right? That we have God and good. It's the same root. So the idea being is that God is the ultimate expression of good. God is all knowing, past, present, and future. Supernatural and transnatural. So the idea that God is beyond, as we said, beyond the natural world. God can upset the natural world. God can change and play around with the world that we live in. So God is beyond us, but God is also within us. God is transnatural, meaning God is within nature. God is expressed in nature. God's expressed within God's creations. So God is at both distant and near at the same time. God is unknowable in the extreme sense, and God is also familiar with being within nature and within our day-to-day encounters. And probably, not most importantly, but very important, the idea that God actually cares and can know and hear our prayer and answer them, or else on Friday talking to ourselves. And so when we pray, it's with the assumption that there's a listener. And now how active that listener is part of our discussion today. But God hears our prayers, is Shomea Tefillah, God is the one who hears prayer. And then in classical theism, God is the one who also answers prayer. So we can pray to God for something, and then we have an expectation, or maybe better said, a hope, that whatever we pray for is going to be heard and answered in some way, though we are, of course, as humans, limited in knowledge of what that might look like, right? So we can pray for something and think that our prayer isn't fulfilled, but maybe it's being fulfilled in a different way. So that's all elements of classical theology for the Jewish tradition, and not only the Jewish tradition, but if we're going to focus on obviously the Jewish components here, that is our sort of classical theistic model. We don't have to worry about this as much, but the idea is that people have tried to prove that God exists in some way. So there's a lot of philosophical arguments that go with the idea of how do we prove God's existence to the idea that, if we look at three, for example, we talked about this with Maimonides, is a cosmological argument, right? That there must be a beginning, right? There has to be something that starts our whole existence. Something has to jump start it. So the idea of the Big Bang theory, but in the Aristotelian sort of terms that Maimonides also co-opts, is the idea there has to be a prime mover. Everything in our universe is moving in some way, but someone has to give the initial shove. Someone has to get everything kick-started. Someone has to light the initial match that sets, everything into motion. And whatever that entity is God. That there's something that has to start everything in the very beginning. The moral argument, of course, the idea of God being the source of all of our moral decisions. There has to be some kind of grand codifier, right, of morality, and that being God. And of course, in a more classical sense, the idea of God being viewed through historical events, mystical experiences, divine revelation, i.e. Torah, for God to be seen as proving God exists. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So classical theism, where they always hit a roadblock and have to find an answer, is the problem of evil. So that comes in to hurt us a bit from a theological standpoint. We've discussed this idea before, that classical theism will have the question, right? If God is all powerful and God is all good, then why is there so much evil in the world? And so there has to be an explanation. It's the constant theological challenge, right? That we have people with faith, in God, and people who consider themselves more agnostic or atheists. It's a primary question: is why is there so much evil? If God, by a classical theistic definition, is all good, and God is also all powerful and all knowing, why is all this bad stuff happening, right?
Because it gives people the freedom to choose.
Bingo, right? And so that's where we come in, is free will. That's an important concept. But even with the idea of free will, there's still that question. 'Cause that's where I usually go with it as well, as free will. So what you're going to get from different theological ideas is that there's evil in the world because of prior sin, right? So there's sin in the world, and that's why evil exists. The Christian community, better said, the Catholic community, gives us the idea of original sin, right? That because of Adam and Eve's sin, that there's sin in the world. That's why the babies need to be baptized, so they are cleansed of the original sin of primordial man and woman. So there's prior sin in the world. That's why there's evil. Evil being the absence of good. Maybe there is no evil, but just when there isn't good to permeate the world, that's when bad things happen. Temporary, evil. The idea that evil here is not forever, and the idea that those who suffer in this world will be rewarded in the afterlife. You get this in Jewish thought. You get it in Christian thought. You get it, I think, really in any monotheistic religion. The idea that, well, don't worry about the evil now. There's a better place in the future, right? And so if you're suffering now, don't worry about it. It's going to get better later. Never been my favorite either. And of course, those who just say there is no answer, right, for evil. There's no answer for it at all. It just is, right? So I think that's actually one of the more honest answers. And so where Steinberg then comes in to answer this question is his theory of limited theism, that what if God's powers are limited? What if we don't have a deity who can actually intervene in the world in the way that we'd like God to? So that's his way of solving the problem of evil in the world. He's saying that maybe God wants to help, but God can't help in the same way. Whether it's because of the theological question of free will, or whether that isn't how God is built. God isn't built that way anymore, or ever was, so to speak. So before we dive into that more, we'll learn a little more about Rabbi Steinberg. A New Yorker, went to school in City College, before spending some time in JTS and getting ordained in the conservative movement in 1928. Influenced by Kaplan, who was the founder of the Reconstructionist movement, but he didn't himself become a Reconstructionist. He had some critiques about Kaplan's theology because Kaplan was even a greater limited theist than he was, whereas Kaplan was God is not personal, God is seen through history. You know, God can't hear prayer. God can't, you know, intervene in traditional Reconstructionist theology. God is just sort of like a force in the world that is in tune with nature, but cannot subvert nature. Steinberg wrote a lot about God, obviously, the nature of God, the question of faith in the modern world, and the impact of non-Jewish thought on Jewish contemporary philosophy. There's a greater course, maybe next year, the year after, to teach about that idea of non-Jewish thought, like contemporary Jewish philosophy, because one could argue with the greatest development for Judaism spiritually in the past 200 or so years, maybe a little more, if I'm doing my math wrong, was the Enlightenment and the ability for Jews to read and connect to the great philosophical works of that time period. Because once Jews started reading Kant and Hegel and Schleiermacher and the rest of them, Otto, you know, they were reading these theologians for the first time, and they had to then figure out how their religious beliefs could answer the challenge of, at that point, current philosophy. So, a little bit of a sidetrack, but you know, still very important. That idea that we're always impacted by our surroundings is the greater point. So he wrote these books. I'm not going to read these, over to you, but just to see that, you know, he wrote extensively about Jewish history and Jewish thought, trying to think about what kind of Jew would the modern world create. This book, As a Driven Leaf, which I highly recommend, a historical fiction of the Talmudic story, which addressed a lot of theological problems. It's a really cool book to read. And he died young, died at 47. So he wrote it very extensively before then. Okay, so we have to start first, of course, with faith, right? So that's where he's going to begin the discussion, is that back to the idea of people trying to prove God's existence. He would argue that you can't, prove God's existence in that same way, that because we are limited, right? We're limited by what our senses can grasp and our mind can conceive, that we can't really have 100% certainty on God. That logic, science isn't going to get us there. That we have to have just a conception of faith. We have to believe that it's true, but we can't know that it's true. We can't know God completely. And so, other people who've tried to prove God's existence, for him, it doesn't work. He thinks that that's one of our realities as human beings, that we don't get to know everything, but we can believe. And faith is at first, it's a leap of faith, so to speak, to believe that God exists and how God works in our world. But it's not something that we can prove. So he doesn't want us to try to prove that God exists. It's a question of faith, whether we believe that God exists.
Oops, sorry.
We got the dog chiming in. So, what was his understanding of God? Very theistic, to start us off. That he does have that sense of earlier rabbinic ideas, of God. Is this visible enough to read?
Yes.
Someone want to read that for me?
Views of God in theistic terms. The entire universe as I see it is the outward manifestation of mind energy, of spirit, or to use the oldest and better word, of God. God is then the essential being of all beings, though all beings in their totality do not exhaust him. God is not only a power, but also a mind, purposeful and ethical, able to enter in relationships without humankind.
Okay, we'll pause right there. Thank you. That's good. So the first bullet there, A, it sounds again very theistic, that the entire universe basically comes from God, right? And that God is, in and above the universe, the essential being of all beings. So God is, everything and anything in between, and nothing that equates, nothing is equal to God. But God isn't only the power that makes for the universe, but God has thought, right? God has rationality, and that God is purposeful and ethical, able to enter into relationships with humankind, which, again, we're going to see with Buber, as we did before. But again, very classical theism, the idea that God is personal. God is able to connect with us individually, that God doesn't leave the world to chance. God, creates the world, and God is able to maintain the world, and God gets involved in the world. So God does not become the absentee landlord of other theologies, that God doesn't just set the world to spinning and goes get a Coke. Like God is here, God is present, God is available to humankind. And if we, on our end, if we want the relationship with God, we're able to do that. We're able to create a meaningful relationship with the divine, that God isn't so far and so beyond us that we can't do that. So while we have that idea of distance, of the God in the universe, and God is the one who is the being of all beings, etc., God is also someone who we can interact with on that one-on-one level, which is certainly embedded in the Bible and in Jewish tradition. The idea of being able to create that relationship with God, more in rabbinic tradition, to be fair, than the Bible, but the Bible as well. But now the big point comes in here at number 2, where his split from classical theism, that God is not all powerful. That by saying that God is not all powerful, it preserves human freedom. That it allows for a God who does not interfere, right, with our day-to-day workings. That we have free will and we're able to, be free and not feel like we're just robots walking along everything. So it preserves human freedom, but then it also allows for the presence of evil at the same time. Because if God is not doing it, and if God doesn't control it, then it allows for the other forces to sort of come through. That God is not there like the hockey goalie blocking all the bad stuff that happens. But that's not, in God's capability. That God can't do it, even if God wanted to do it. God can't do it. It's God is not all powerful. Because if God was all powerful and could stop all the bad stuff from happening and chose not to, then God, by definition, cannot be all good. So in order to preserve God's goodness, it's better to curtail God's power than God's goodness. Does that make sense?
I don't think I agree with the word allows for the presence of evil. I wish there was another word.
Yeah, I mean, what's your question?
He preserves human freedom, allows for the present. That means he thinks it's acceptable that he allows.
It's not that God allows it, it's that our reality allows it. So the theology allows. Yeah, the philosophy allows for the presence of evil, not God allows.
Okay, the philosophy allows for.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So this way of looking at God permits, it allows that to take place, because it's trying to help create a world where evil can happen, and it's not God's fault. That's what it's trying to do. It's trying to get God off the hook. That's one of the earliest struggles that we have, even in the Torah, right? I mean, what are the first 2 stories of the Torah after creation? You have Adam and Eve, and you have Cain and Abel, and they're both about human responsibility. So even in the very genesis, no pun intended, of Jewish theology, the first questions that are being asked are about this idea of why is there evil in the world. Adam and Eve, they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That gets the ball rolling. And God doesn't stop them, right? God puts the tree there. God puts temptation in their midst. And the people have to make a choice, human freedom. They have to make a choice whether or not they're going to eat from the tree or not. And then Cain and Abel, it's even more pointed. It's, God literally choosing one sacrifice over the other. God chooses Abel's offering, rejects Cain's. Cain gets upset and smashes his brother's head in with a rock, according to tradition. And then when God comes to Cain and says, "Hey, where's your brother Abel?" Cain says, "What am I, my brother's keeper? How am I supposed to know?" And the rabbis take that, further in a rabbinic, bit of imagination about really Cain putting God on trial and saying, "It's your fault. You're the one who rejected my sacrifice. And if you wanted Abel to be safe, you should have saved him yourself. Instead of sitting back like the emperor in the Roman Colosseum, right? Doing thumbs up or thumbs down. You let me kill Abel, God. It's your fault. If you wanted Abel alive, you should have stopped me." And God says, no, it's not how it works. No, that we all have free will. You did this evil yourself. You can't blame me. And so just in the very beginnings of Jewish thought and theology, this question of how can we have evil in the world comes into the forefront. And Steinberg is trying to create this philosophy, this theology that says evil can exist in the world, but God is not responsible for it. That's what he's trying to get to solve the problem of evil, as they all try to do. So God is absolutely.
So if God is not responsible,
Yeah.
Who is responsible? I'm responsible, right?
So it's humanity is responsible, for some evils, and sometimes it just is. I think is what they would say. Sometimes it just plain is, depending on which philosopher you get to, because there are evils that are clearly not human-made, in my opinion. But they would say that's the price you pay for living as a mortal. We have the gift of life, but that comes with challenges and hardships too, that we would view as evil.
Doesn't that sound like taking the easy way out?
In what way?
Well, God is responsible, and this is good. This is so. It isn't always your fault either. Then nobody takes responsibility for good or evil. That's what it feels.
I mean, I'm thinking more of like illness and of natural disasters. That
I'm thinking more of war and battles.
Yeah, but with war and battles, I feel like there's an easier connection to human activity. That humans, are greedy and selfish and violent sometimes, and just plain terrible sometimes, and that's free will. So that's why we have.
God has nothing to do with greed or selfishness, right?
Which part?
Well, you're saying that God has nothing to do with man's greed or selfishness or irresponsibility.
I'm not sure if I'm saying as much as the philosophers are saying it, but the idea being that if we want to say that God implants within us, right, these two different sides, the impulse to do good and the impulse to do not so good, right? One can look at it that way then, and saying that, well, why didn't God make us 100% moral? But then I think again that robs human choice, where we have the choice of whether we want to act well or whether we want to be terrible.
So we all have God-like qualities.
Yeah.
But that makes God imperfect too.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I think that's where it comes into. Whereas, is that an interesting way of looking at it when we think about being created in the image of God? Maybe instead of looking at it, as we might do in terms of just the good stuff, right? We can say maybe we're imperfect, and so God is also imperfect.
Maybe.
Like that's certainly another way of viewing it, right? And this and maybe Steinberg would jump on that too. The idea of saying, well, if we're limited and we're created in the divine image, maybe God is limited too. You know, and that's what it means to be created in the divine image, is that none of us are all powerful.
Well, that makes more sense to me than saying that, you know, there's no responsibility there.
You know, we're saying that God isn't responsible, that we are responsible. And yeah, but yeah, sometimes it is, sometimes it just is, right? Sometimes evil just exists in the world, and it's no one's fault. The idea of, and I sort of hate bringing up the medical stuff because I know that can be a button for people, but childhood cancers, or automobile accidents or whatever it might be. It's like sometimes things are our fault, sometimes things aren't our fault. But they're still viewed as evil, or maybe another word is they're viewed as tragic, or and maybe there isn't a value judgment about good or evil into it. That could be another way of thinking about it.
Natural.
Unnatural, yeah. And so we have this idea of, it's Steinberg's words again, that God is absolute, in the sense of being a creator to whom we stand as creatures, right? While being at the same time a self-limiting power. And so that's where it's a little bit different, is that maybe God is self-limiting, as opposed to saying that God is by nature limited. God is limiting God's self. God is limiting the divine power. To the extent of that reality of our freedom, God is limited in God's power. If a person is to have real freedom, God's control cannot be complete. So we've touched on that idea already, right? That idea that we can't, in order for us to have free will, God can't be pulling all the strings,
right,
for us. There has to be some kind of understanding that we have free will. So I think that's really good. Then we have here, and here's a good word that's not used enough. God is indubitably the power of rationality, of order, of design, of meaningfulness, of creativity. Yet traditional conceptions of God are somehow inadequate to deal with the problem of evil, which we've discussed already, a bit. That idea that some of these traditional matrices of how we view God give us pause or give us trouble when it comes to dealing with the problem of evil, because the all-powerful God and the all-knowing God then should be able to stop bad things from happening. God should be Superman to our Lois Lane, and that whenever we fall out of the building or whatever it might be, God's going to swoop in to catch us. But since that's not how the world works, then that's, a problem that has to be dealt with. But why isn't God saving us from all the bad stuff that goes on, in our world? So we have to find the way to figure that out. And his answer is this limited conception of God, limited theists. So how do we explain evil? Limited theists believe that nature is the process of evolving according to God's will to higher and higher levels. It's an interesting concept of sort of evil as not being evolved enough in terms of, so let's look at what that means. So this idea that there are parts of the world that have not gotten to a better place, that evil is sort of like, it's unevolved good, that it has to progress to get to a better place. So in each species of the universe, there are some lower stages of development. This is the evolutionary model. He's giving us more of the Darwinian first, in a way. This idea that there are parts that are underdeveloped in us, right? In our makeup, in our potentialities, right? That we have good parts of us, and we have not so good parts of us. And those not good parts of us are maybe underdeveloped. They have to create something different there, but right now they're not. Right now it's still there as a negative force. And so evil is found in these lower stages. So evil represents the survival into the human condition of other lower stages of reality, mineral, vegetable, and animal, out of which we have emerged and on which we stand. So we are developing, if we think about this, and yeah, it's a little heady, but the idea that we as a species are constantly evolving, and one would hope, one could argue we aren't, but one will hope that with each generation we're getting better, as people. I feel like that doesn't always feel that way.
Sounds like wishful thinking on
yeah,
our part.
Yeah, I can understand that point. That it does sound like wishful thinking in a way. but the idea that he would like to have is that with each generation we're becoming more moral and more ethical and more whatever. Arguable, I guess.
Yeah,
You
not
know,
holding my breath on that one.
yeah, I can understand that perspective. I'll put it that
Mm.
way. So it's the persistence of the circumstances of lower strata and the higher, the carryover of the limitations of the orders of being on which our existence is based into our personality and society. So basically, we aren't there yet.
Yeah.
That we still have bad stuff in our personalities, bad stuff in our world that we can hopefully, if we work on them, can get them out. I was watching something earlier, the idea of fishing the garbage out of the pool before it freezes over for winter. Okay, and it's like the more we can get the stuff out of our systems now before it hardens and becomes a part of our personality, the better it is. But some of this stuff we just sort of have and need to get rid of, and it's those things that help create evil in the world. So you can almost go back to the idea of the Yetzer Hara. That if we have this greed and selfishness and anger and whatever it is, these are almost like unevolved feelings and emotions that we need to maybe work on and do better. Not the easiest thing to figure out, but nonetheless. But the bigger point is number two, that if we regard evil as just part of what the universe is, then it once again extricates God from the equation and doesn't put the blame of evil on God. It's important for Steinberg, as it is for moral theists and limited theists and classical theists, to not blame God for the bad in the world. Once you start doing that, it's hard to pray, and it's hard to believe in a God, and it's hard to connect with a God who does bad stuff. Like once you start blaming God for everything bad, it's harder to deal with.
God created the world, right?
Yes.
We believe that God created the world. Well, if I believe that, which I do, then God created good and evil.
Yeah, the way they would look at it is that God creates good and the potential for evil. It's a little bit hair splitty, I know.
It doesn't take much to see the potential because you see it right away. You already said that.
Yeah.
You see it in Adam and Eve. You see it in Cain and Abel. I mean, you see it in the Holocaust. And so, I mean, it makes a lot of disbelievers.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
I think that's a fair point to make. And that's why Adam and Eve, they have to figure out a way to bring the evil into the world. And then you can keep dialing it back, right? And saying, well, if God didn't want this to happen, why did God put the tree right in the middle of the garden? God could have not put the tree there at all, right? Just be in the Garden of Eden and have fun. Don't mess around. But God puts the tree there as a test to see about humanity's limitations.
Yeah, what has been a short Genesis? Yeah.
It turns out we fail, right? I mean, we failed the first test, and we are failing tests more than once in the Torah, right? And so God doesn't create utopia for us. That's part of the human experience and the human experiment, right? Is that we have to sort of create it for ourselves. And whether or not we're capable of creating utopia, I think is a pretty reasonable question to see whether we can ever do that. It's to create Eden again, as I forgot her name. It'll come to me later. Judy Chicago. Creating Eden again. It's a great poem. It's not the title of it, but it's a great poem. So God. So he actually this actually plays with it, right? So God is exempted not from the struggle, but from the responsibility of the elements of chance within God's universe. So God is with us in the struggle for it, that we know that it's there. So God is with us in the struggle against evil, right? God's with us in the struggle to do better, but God is not responsible for said evil in this paradigm, in this philosophy. And so this goes back to the idea that it's very important in all of this, is that God is not all powerful, but God must remain in this theology and in others all good. That God cannot be considered to be, evil, or else again it makes prayer problematic and divine service problematic, as Karen pointed out. It creates a lot of disbelievers if you're going to sort of go that route. And so in Steinberg's conception, right, of his theology, God is not a king with a capital K, nor the King of Kings, that this idea is outdated and irrelevant to the modern worshiper, that God cannot be seen as this all-powerful ruler. It just doesn't jibe with our experience of what God is in our world today. This is going to be a little gendered, so I apologize for that, but I wanted to preserve the author's words here. But every time you see father, you can easily put, parent or mother in it as well. So this is a Rabbi Levi Olan, who's going to speak about the idea how God should be viewed as a father. But again, we can put parent or mother in there as we do. So Rabbi Levi Olan says, a father is both inside the child and outside of him. He is, if you will, immanent and transcendent at one and the same time. In our childhood, father was all-knowing, all-powerful. He could do everything. As we mature, the image changes. Father no longer knows everything and cannot do everything. Yet he is probably closer and nearer to us. The figure of a father who loves us and cannot always do what he would love to do for us comes closer to our experience than that of an absolute monarch. And so again, this is presuming a couple things, which is positive relationships with our parents, but we have this idea of development. This is what's his name? I'm not gonna get that. No, this is my wife's field, but I'm thinking about in psychology. This is a big idea as well. It's certainly Freudian amongst others, that there's a eventual differentiation that goes on between child and parent, and that in the beginning, children see their parents as God-like figures who can do no wrong and who can do everything. But sooner than perhaps we would like, our kids find out that it's not true, and that their parents are fallible and they're flawed and they have different set of issues, as we all do. But it doesn't mean that they love us any less or we love them any less for that knowledge. And so he's taking that image of that limited parental figure and then pushing that into a grander idea of the divine, and saying just as like our parents are not these godlike, all perfect, all-knowing creatures, God isn't that either. That, and it's almost, it's almost not, well, that is the wrong word, but there's something, special about the relationship without it, in a way that makes it actually better in a way, or more special or more real, right? If it's the idea that God can't just fix everything for us, because that's not what life is.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Sure.
Did Rabbi Olin come before or after Rabbi Steinberg? Because what he said makes a lot more sense to me.
This one, I think he was a contemporary, but I'll look it up for us. I can ask Rabbi Google and sort of see. That's always,
He's all, knows all.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's like all knowing.
Rabbi Google. That's funny.
So let's see, in real time here.
Rabbi Google. That's cute.
Yeah, Rabbi Google says that they're contemporaries.
Okay.
Okay.
So Steinberg was ordained in 28, I'm sorry, and he was ordained in 1929 from HUC. And so he lived longer. He lived into his 80s. And so I think they were around the same time in terms of their spiritual development. And so that's the image that he gives us here. Hold on just 1 second. Now that I'm seeing all this stuff here.
Is that Eric? Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so
I think he's got to go out.
it's my parents
They
there.
have to sign off here.
Okay, so here we go. So we're just going to finish up here with humanity as God's co-worker, because if we're both limited, right, we need to work together. So nature contains aspects which are less than perfect, which can become a source of evil. So we have a large role to play in overcoming these limitations. God needs the help of humankind, and we need the help of God. again, I happen to like the imagery that resonates with me, is the idea of partnership with God, is that God has given us this creation, this reality, to live and to work and to do good in the world. And God can't do it all for us. But I love the idea of us helping each other, right? That God sort of gives us this and says, hey, did the best I could in a way. This is the reality you're living with. You got to work it, and I'll help you. You have to help me. And so we're working together to make the world better, which I think, again, that image is pleasing to me, is the idea of partnership with God. That both God and God's creations are then faced with a common task and a common battle. They may share together in opposing the same unreason and bringing greater light and order to the universe, which to me, again, strikes the heart of religion, the idea that it's a process, right? It's process theology in a way, that we aren't, fully formed. We are evolving. We are hopefully getting better with time, but that it's not going to happen automatically. It's going to be work. It's going to be effort to move from potential to reality, and that God
Nice
is
thought.
asking us to help out.
We're getting better with time. Have you noticed we're getting better with time?
You know what? Some ways yes, in some ways no. But we're not. I think it just shows that we're not there yet. I'd like to think that we're better today than we were 100 years ago, and better than we were 1,000 years ago in a lot of ways. But in some ways, we ain't there yet.
I would like to chat sometime about the idea that we all have a divine spark within us. Anyway, that's a whole different philosophy that if there's time to talk about it, I just wondered if that's a part of any Jewish philosopher's thought at all.
Oh yeah, well I think it's actually part of all of their thought. That there's some sort of divine spark within everybody. And what that looks like, I think, is the question. Because I think that's where the philosophy differs. It's not that the question of the divine spark, what that actually means. How does that manifest itself, in the world?
More and more people are talking about it as love, God's love, and that's
nice. I have it's nice. I have no problem with it. I had a professor who always said that's nice, because he was more moralist, and so he looks at more right and wrong. So he didn't always love that kind of thing. But the idea being that, I mean, it goes back to B'Tselem Elohim, right? And the idea of what do we mean when we say we're created in the divine image, and the more, the sense of God being all good, that means God's implanting a spark of goodness, sort of within us. Goodness, right, truth, justice in the American way, whatever it might be. But love certainly, gets in there as well. The idea of, I look at it as that if we all have God within us, that means we all have certain rights, responsibilities, and equality, inherent equality. So that's where I sort of go with it. That if we're all God's creations, that means that we all are entitled to the same love, respect, justice as our fellow. That's usually where I go with it. But others take it in different directions. But for me, that's to me fundamental and foundational in my own theology, is the idea that that we are all created in God's image, and if there's God in us, that means there's good in us. And if there's God and good in us, it's our job to seek out the God and the good in others, and to create sacred relationship from that divine spark. So
that makes sense to me.
I like that one. It's about that time. Is there any questions? This is going to kick us off in a few minutes anyway. We only got 2 hours from 7 to 9 on this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is everybody doing okay?
Yes.
That's a good idea. Let's check in. So everyone's okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
I care.
Yeah, it's been wild. I mean, not in a good way, to be honest, but but we're all doing okay. We just found out today that our nanny has coronavirus.
Oh no.
Yeah. Now she hasn't been with us for like 3 weeks.
Oh, good.
for us personally in the house, we're doing okay. But for her, we're worried.
Yeah,
Obviously,
Mhm.
yeah, but with
that's
3
important.
kids, I would worry a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, and so
Yeah.
we last saw her like March 13th, because then we had spring break and we were gone. And
Yeah.
by the time that we were back, she had texted us saying she wasn't feeling so well. I'm like, well, stay away from us if you aren't, feeling
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Then she thought it was the flu, and she finally got tested for the other thing, and she came back positive today with it. And so she's going to
Oh,
be
wow.
out
Well,
of commission for a little while for us.
well, just keep good
So
thoughts because
we're
it's
going to
hard.
have good thoughts and good prayers for her to
Yeah.
feel better. And I'm going to be balancing homeschooling and synagogue for a little bit.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
Gonna be a while longer yet.
Going to be a
Yeah.
while longer yet, and
Yeah.
we don't know how long this whole thing's going to last. But it's going to be for a little while. We're guessing, and the temple
Yeah.
right now is thinking about how we're probably not going to have in-person services again until the summer, probably. So.
Mhm.
And
Probably
even
not.
then, we're not making any guarantees.
Yeah.
We're cautiously optimistic, but we also want to be realistic as
Right.
well. And we're not going
Right.
to rush anything. And we're going to go by the judgment of the CDC and what else is that. We're working really
Yeah, the
hard to be.
CDC, the World Health Organization, those kind of people. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, we're gonna trust scientists on this one.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
even to the extent that we're not doing services anymore at the synagogue, we're gonna just. I'm going to stream from my house, and Laura's going to
Oh, we
stream.
lost you last week. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yet another reason to do it from home, because the reception at the synagogue is god awful.
Yeah.
Yeah,
when
it
we're
does
recording.
bounce around. Okay.
And
Has
so,
any, oh,
yeah, go ahead.
has anybody heard why the governor of this state has not had stay-at-home policy enforced for the state of Florida?
I don't know.
No. Do you really want to know? No.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Rob,
I really would like to know. I'm a New York, I'm a New York resident as of now, and I'd like to know why even though I live down here 6 months out of the year, I want to know why the governor doesn't want to close down, stay-at-home policy for the state of Florida. My son.
Because tourism is the #1 thing that's
But
profitable.
there is no tourism now. But there's no tourism.
Yeah, there's still tourism. You're still here, aren't you?
No, I
You
live.
can't go home right now. So he's trying to make, that's my opinion. He's trying to make.
I'm not a
not
tourist.
light
I'm a
of-
tax. Who said that, Karen?
Yeah.
I'm
yeah.
not a tourist. I'm a taxpayer. I pay.
I know what I mean.
taxes in both
But
states.
what I'm saying is you're here. We have a lot of snowbirds. And most of whom probably are not leaving. And I think he's trying to make it as pleasant as possible, even when it cannot be,
It took us a while to close those beaches, that I'll say.
Yeah.
Yes, it did.
Just kind of bizarre.
And so
Okay.
we're just going to keep hoping for better health. We're going to be, continuing to do this Zoom stuff for a while, and try to provide different experiences via Zoom. So obviously Torah study and Derech Torah Seder, the second night we're going to do over Zoom. We're going to do services from Zoom. And we're just going to try to sort of punch in and do different things.
Okay.
And frankly, again, this might last a couple months. So we're going to be looking for new ideas. And how to sort of keep, I hope people who are connected on Facebook, you can see it, I think now from the TBI page, Barbara put up something on Monday, that was very nice. Barbara.
Well, Gary said somebody called him, but nobody's called me. So if there's people that you want to be called just to check on, should let us know. So some of us, I'll be glad to make phone calls.
oh, that would be
I'd
great.
be glad to too.
Yeah, that's lovely.
In Polly's letter, or one of her things,
Yeah.
that please let her know, because, that we're trying to keep in touch with with people.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, that's all I was thinking.
Yeah,
I
we're
keep in touch
going
with,
through our lists.
but yeah, if you've got some other people, I'll be, glad to make phone calls because I'm getting really good at that.
Yeah, Polly would be great. Very happy to hear from you.
Yeah, well, I can call or text her or whatever. Okay.
To
Email.
everyone, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay in touch virtually, okay?
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Rabbi. This is
Thank
great
you.
as always.
Thank
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Great seeing everybody. I really like seeing the smiling faces on this. It really does help.
Julie's
Okay.
one of my new best friends, I'll say that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Good
Bye,
night.
everybody.
Cindy.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
All right.
Thank you.